In this video, I'll tell you about the hobby tax and how you can try to avoid it at the hardware store. Have you ever heard of the hobby tax? It's a term that kind of explains why sometimes there's a price difference, sometimes a really big price difference, between the price of a gadget or material purchased from a hobby store and that same thing purchased from a non-hobby store. A hobby knife purchased at a hardware store will be considerably cheaper than a hobby knife purchased from Games Workshop. Now, all right, admittedly, this is more of an example of the Games Workshop tax, but the same rule can apply to, any kind of non-GW hobby store as well, just probably not as drastic. Sometimes this hobby tax is deserved. For example, God Hand plastic snippers are very expensive for snippers, but they are purpose-built for snipping plastic parts cleanly away from plastic sprues. They're not multi-purpose. These are not wire cutters, right? Like you won't find something comparable on the shelf at your local hardware store. Yes, you will find other snippers, but not ones as purpose-built for this specific task. Will the snippers at the hardware store snip? Most likely, yes, probably so. But they might not snip as cleanly as the fancy $60 Japanese snippers that Gundam modelers swear by. So it's personal preference whether you decide to buy some of your hobby tools from places like hardware stores or dollar stores or whatever versus, actual hobby stores and hobby manufacturers. It also depends where you are in your hobby career as well. I see people sometimes just starting out to paint miniatures and they're using craft paints from craft stores and discount stores and things like that. They're good-sized bottles of acrylic paints for maybe $1 or maybe $1.50. They aren't usually good paints for painting miniatures because the pigments aren't as finely ground as, miniature paints are, which makes kind of a big deal when the thing that you're painting is only 1.5 inches high. If you are just starting out in miniature painting, I would again suggest the starter set from the Army Painter. It comes with nearly everything that you need to start painting. Paints, metallic, wash, even includes a primer for priming a model. It comes with a brush, and it even gives you a miniature to practice on. I made a video last year about how to get into wargaming for less than $100. Pachow. And I mentioned the old version of this starter kit in that video. The new version that came out in early 2024 with the new Fanatic paints and all that kind of stuff and the miniature and it's even better. Just skipped the craft paints. However, there are other good reasons to go to the hardware store. There are products at the hardware store that are great for hobby usage, but don't really have any kind of a comparable hobby product version that might be more suited for your wargaming stuff. That also means no hobby tax on those things either. You just kind of need to know what it is to look for and maybe think about some of those things in a different way. Some of this may just be because I love to wander around in hardware stores and look to see if any of the products are multi-purpose. Many of them actually are. I bought this stuff at a local hardware store, but I'll bet that you could probably find it in some other types of stores too, like maybe even department stores or maybe even in grocery stores. But this brand is really what's important here. Gorilla Brand mounting putty. I've talked about why and how poster putty like this stuff is important to your hobby work. I did a video years ago. Pachow. And I've used poster putty on and off for projects forever. But I needed some more recently and was at my local hardware store and saw this stuff on an end cap and picked it up. I'm really glad I did. If you've heard of the original Gorilla Glue, then you know this company. I've used Gorilla Glue in the past, and it was a pretty unique glue and seems to work really, really well. As it got more popular, then they kind of started making more Gorilla Brand everything, right? Gorilla Tape, Gorilla Wood Glue, Gorilla Super Glue. I just kind of assumed that it was a branding thing where they just renamed stuff and called it Gorilla. I actually decided to try out the Gorilla mounting putty in this situation to see if it was the same kind of lackluster stuff as the generic brands, or maybe something better, kind of like their original glue. I'm happy to report that the Gorilla Brand mounting putty is the best poster putty that I've ever used. It stays stickier longer. It stays pliable longer. Some of the generic brands that I would buy in the past would already be mostly dried out in the packaging before I'd even open them. I know this sounds like sponsored or something like that, but I assure you, the Gorilla brand people haven't reached out to me and they haven't paid me a dime or even given me any free putty or anything. But, whatever. I just really wasn't using poster putty that much in my hobby anymore until I found this stuff. Usually I use the Games Workshop paint handles to kind of hold my miniatures while I paint. They're got, spring-loaded, and they grip the base of the miniature, and they work just fine. It's easy to put them on, it's easy to take them off, all that kind of stuff. I have way too many of them as well. But before the GW paint handles, I used to use a glob of poster putty to stick my miniatures to pill bottles, empty pill bottles mostly. It worked fine, except when the poster putty would either get too hard and be a pain to remove, or else it wouldn't stick enough, and then the model would fall off while you're trying to paint it. This was worst with metal models, as they were usually heavier and were more likely to fall off and damage themselves when they would land. But like I said, I was mostly using the GW handles, and they pretty much worked fine. But recently, I wanted to airbrush prime a whole bunch of Skaven models all at once, from the spearhead. And I didn't want to put them all on individual handles because there were 20 of them, and I have a lot of handles, but I don't think I have 20, right? I wanted to stick them to wooden paint stirring sticks, those kind of foot-long little skinny wooden sticks, which are also, from the hardware store and a great little hobby, product as well. So I was going to need new poster putty to stick 4 or 5 of them to each stick so I could airbrush them kind of in an assembly line situation. And I came home from the store with this Gorilla brand stuff. Now I'm using it a lot more, and it's working great. If you've tried poster putty in the past and kind of found it wanting, try out the Gorilla stuff. Another thing that I get from the hardware store that would be way more expensive if they were made for hobby usage, aka, again, the hobby tax, plastic storage boxes, specifically plastic shoe boxes, which can be pretty sturdy, yet still relatively inexpensive, and they have kind of nice lids that stay on pretty well. And then, of course, there's also meal prep plastic containers, which are smaller generally and a little bit flimsier, but they also have nice lids that stay on pretty well. I use these things to keep projects organized. The size of the project kind of dictates whether I use the meal prep box or the shoe box, but they work great. If I'm kind of hopping between projects, the worst thing that can happen is that I put all the parts to an unfinished project, miniatures, terrain, whatever, somewhere where they get separated from each other, like in a pile on my hobby desk. That is the worst when you put, and then, sometimes you move a project to make way for another one, and then some important component falls behind the desk, and then you never see it again, or, whatever. But an appropriately sized plastic container that's inexpensive can keep all the bits and bobs together in one place. Plus, they're generally easily stackable, and they can be labeled so you know, what's where, right? But if you don't think that you need to label the box because, you'll be right back to this project that you stalled out on ASAP, right? At least they're usually clear to some degree, so you don't have to open the container to see what's held inside if you didn't put some sort of label on it, right? In a hobby that always has lots and lots and lots of smaller fiddly parts, organization is key, and these inexpensive little containers have helped me keep things together. Another thing that I love to look at and kind of pore over at the hardware store is terrain. Now, they generally don't sell terrain there, but they do sell weird plastic doohickeys for your house there, and those can be made into terrain. Yes, it's true. Anything can be made into terrain if you believe in yourself, but I'm talking about things like PVC pipe couplings, plastic rain gutter connectors, and plastic electrical outlet boxes, just to name a few. All these things can start as the basis for a new terrain build for your game board. A few months back, I made a video showing how I turned a plastic rain gutter downspout elbow connector thingy into a fun sci-fi terrain piece of a huge vent for an underground facility. Pachow. And it was a really, really fun project. I really enjoyed doing it. I'm actually working on another one of those things, but slightly smaller, a little bit more squared off one, as well. The squared off sort of shape on those things really makes it look more sci-fi, but a regular like round PVC pipe connector thing could also look sci-fi, or it could even look maybe modern, right? Or perhaps even steampunk with the right embellishments and paint job. That's really what makes your piece of terrain when you start with a piece of stuff that you got at the hardware store. These pieces are jumping off points for whatever kind of terrain stuff you want to make. After I get my second kind of sci-fi vent project finished, I want to make some small kind of sci-fi utility building out of one of these plastic electrical outlet boxes. They're technically designed to be kind of sunk into a hole in your wall, and then they hold your electrical outlets or whatever so you can plug stuff in and all that kind of jazz. But when you set them on the open side, right, on the bottom like that, and usually have to cut away a few pieces and bits and stuff like that with either some heavy-duty clippers or maybe a Dremel tool, then they make some interesting nondescript, small, sci-fi-ish looking utility buildings. Maybe put a door or a hatch on there, some pipes or whatever, and you're ready to paint. And of course, at the hardware store, there's also MDF and different types of hardboard and plywood and things like that. There's acrylic sheet. All those different things can be used to make really good bases for your terrain. And then, of course, there's the different types of foam, that pink foam, the light blue foam, the light green foam that you can carve and turn into hills and rocks and all that kind of stuff as well. The hobby store is great, right? And it's where I get my paints and my brushes and, of course, many games and models as well. But remember that the hardware store can be useful and an inexpensive place to get things for your hobby and terrain. If you have some extra time, walk around the hardware store and try to imagine what kinds of cool hobby uses some of the stuff there could have. You could avoid the hobby tax. So what did I miss? What kinds of hobby products are hidden amongst the shelves and hooks and bins of the hardware store? Have you turned unconventional items into terrain or something else for your hobby? Let us all know down in the comments below. If you like this video and others like it, and you want to help out the channel, a simple depressmentation of the like button down there will help immensely. And if you want to see more videos like this every single Friday, you can subscribe as well. It's free. Thanks for watching.